Birmingham, Alabama, 1963. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. From drinking fountains to local theaters, racism and bigotry had kept black and white Americans apart. Many white Americans believed that's how things were supposed to be, even elected public officials.
You can never whip these boys if you don't keep you and them separate. I found that out in Birmingham. You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
Officials such as Eugene Bull Connor. Connor was elected Birmingham's Commissioner of Public Safety in 1961 and was a great endorser of segregation. Connor was willing to do anything in his personal and political power to make sure America keeps the whites and blacks separate. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC for short, felt differently. Wyatt T. Walker, Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shuttlesworth, and Martin Luther King Jr. had come to the conclusion that the only way segregation was going to end was through major demonstrations and peaceful protests. Hence, the birth of the Birmingham Campaign, also known as Project C, C for confrontation, as these major leaders believed that the only way to freedom is to meet with the issue face to face. This, of course, was easier said than done. The campaign had officially taken its first steps on April 3, 1963. It started off small and gradually increased in intensity, starting off with small sit-ins, then to boycotts, and finally, nonviolent protests. Many marches and protests had taken place as the campaign went on and caught more attention of the media. One of the most significant, however, was one that was held on April 12, 1963. It was during this peaceful march that Martin Luther King Jr., along with 50 other protesters, was arrested and thrown into a Birmingham jail for the next 8 days. It was during these 8 days, however, that King composes what may be considered one of the most important and influential documents of this time, Letters from a Birmingham Jail. King describes the motive for all that he and thousands of other black folk all across the South are fighting for. He addresses the white clergymen and asks them to put themselves in the shoes of the oppressed. King goes on to define the difference between a just and an unjust law, and addresses the criticisms of the civil rights movement that had been referred to and accused as unlawful and civilly disobedient. King makes rebuttals towards the accusations with historical references to other times civil disobedience was used to fight for what was right, such as the Boston Tea Party or the fight of the Hungarian freedom fighters. In referencing these historical breakthroughs, King ultimately comes down to the point that nonviolent tension is necessary for growth. King peacefully continues to address his concerns and intentions of fighting on and pushing through as he encourages the black community to do the same if they want to see change.
If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the opposition we now face will surely fail. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands.
Following the march on April 12th that led to the arrest of Martin Luther King Jr., another greatly significant demonstration during this time was the Children's March on May 2nd, just a month later. During this demonstration, thousands of young African American students had marched out into the streets of Birmingham and sang for their freedom. However, Commissioner Bull Connor took harsh action against the protesters and called for the release of canines to attack the students, ripping their clothes and limbs, as well as have officers beat them and spray these protesters with high-pressure power hoses. These water hoses, according to former Birmingham protester Reverend Carolyn McKinstry, forced water out with tremendous pressure and was a very painful experience. By the end of the march, over 600 of these students were arrested and taken into tight jail spaces. However, a vast majority of the brutalities of this event was news broadcasted for America to see, allowing for the nationwide attention of this tragic reality. Months later, after many failed negotiations, the problem has come to the attention of President John F. Kennedy. On June 11, 1963, President Kennedy had given a civil rights address that had covered and discussed the oppression and hardships evident for African Americans living in the South. Kennedy had made clear that regardless of a person's skin color, all Americans hold the same unalienable rights that were promised by our founding fathers. Kennedy brings up statistics on the unlikely likelihood of a black man becoming successful in America due to racial prejudices. He mentions that when compared to a typical white American man, a typical black individual living in America has half the chance of completing high school, a third as much a chance of completing college, 2 times as much a chance of becoming unemployed, and is expected to have a life expectancy of 7 years less. Many of Kennedy's points had coincided with Martin Luther King's philosophies of change through the understanding of morality rather than rule, as he states that law alone cannot make men see right, and that we are confronted primarily with a moral issue. Later on within the speech, Kennedy states that all Americans have the basic right to utilize public facilities. From public schools to retail stores, Kennedy considers such facilities to be an elementary right for all Americans, regardless of race. A year later, after the tragic assassination of President Kennedy, President Lyndon B. Johnson had taken up the cause of the civil rights movement in his own hands. Finally, on July 2, 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed through Congress, ensuring all Americans an equal participation in public facilities and protecting the rights of the formerly oppressed, to prevent discrimination and federally assisted programs to establish a commission on equal employment opportunity. Through all the years of both physical and emotional pain, through sheer determination and willpower, by sticking together for a future of brotherhood and compassion, African Americans of this time period were able to strengthen the unity of the entire nation, bringing everyone closer through acts of nonviolence and patience, and have made for themselves a future where the screams of attacked mothers and children are no longer heard amongst the streets, but rather they are filled with the melodic song of the freedom bell. For both generations who have seen such torment and for generations who had not yet been born, let freedom ring.